Following the roots of therapy within art education. Content. What is art therapy? Why was the term therapy established? Industrial Revolution, art therapy in education, and conclusion. The extensive research is to identify the ideological roots of the belief in art's power to heal, key historical figures and their contributions to the development of art therapy as an occupation, and the evaluation of policies that guided the profession into education. Though this is a compiling of experts' views, it is best to take note that not all information will be relevant to all people working in art therapy, and that it is best to hear this with an open mind. Most people do not quite understand the term therapy because they automatically prejudge it. Terms such as psychotic person sitting in a chair pouring out emotional banter to a psychiatrist usually comes to mind. But what they do not know is that this term was not even used until Adrian Hill, an artist in England, referred to the therapeutic applications of art as art therapy. Art therapy became a discipline in 1940, but it predates psychology and psychiatry. Art therapy today is the use of art in a therapeutic setting for the psychological growth or improvement of humans. However, 40,000 years ago, in the Augustan period before art therapy was even coined, cave paintings were created in El Castello cave in Cantabria, Spain. These cave paintings were for means of communication, religious practice, or for emotional exploration. Therefore, the term therapy is all about the visual representation of emotion, not just the discussion of emotion by psychotic persons. The philosopher in ancient Greece named Plato was one of the finest thinkers of his time and established ideas about the arts. He stated that a piece of art was not the actual object, it was a biased representation of the object by its creator. Therefore, Plato regarded art as having psychological effects that were disastrous, for it aroused the passions and perverted the just and healthy order of the soul. He considered art to be a flight from reality and true knowledge. These ideas established by Plato caused artisans to want to better society through the means of art creation. After years of artisans creating, the term art therapy was established by Adrian Hill in England during 1940 when he had tuberculosis. It is a synonymous word for treatment. Adrian Hill realized that creating art helped him recover because it kept his mind off the pain. This, in turn, was also used to help injured soldiers from World War I. Before the Industrial Revolution, self-taught artists and self-taught farmers raised their children, and the only form of education was either homeschooling, apprenticeships, one-on-one education, or small village schoolhouses. During this time, parents would have the time to pay more attention to if their children fell ill, and when they did fall ill, their mother would tend to them, typically giving them crayons or pencils to pass the time away. Though this was typical practice, they didn't really understand art's healing capabilities. They also did not know that children had feelings. They saw them as mini adults. These mini adults, they called them, had to do the same hard jobs as their parents. When technology became more advanced during the Industrial Revolution, the parent-child relationship changed. Due to machines, production of goods increased, population growth changed, children were not getting the proper education from parents, and children had to work on heavy-duty machines where they would get hurt a lot on due to their small hands and inexperience. Therefore, by the 1840s, a few public schools had popped up around the country in the communities that could afford them. However, that smattering of schools wasn't good enough for education crusaders Horace Mann of Massachusetts and Henry Barnard of Connecticut. They believed that education was needed to help ready young children to work in the factories because then they would be less likely to get hurt. Their adamant stance on education made it mandated for all children to attend school, at least up until elementary school in the state of Massachusetts during the year of 1852. And then all states passed it as well in 1918. These schools, though, were based on the original precedent that children were no different than an adult, and most of the schools were rigid with no thought to their emotional well-being. The Industrial Revolution in the United States during 1820 to 1870 caused experts to struggle to replace self-taught artists due to mental illness. Education was also changing, going from small village groups to standardized public schools. Therefore, art therapy, after it was established as a treatment, was the answer to their long sought out problems in the workforce and school system, even if it took 70 years for it to be fully implemented. At this time, psychiatrists began springing up all over and were becoming increasingly interested in the artwork created by their patients with mental illness, and educators were discovering that children's art reflected their developmental, emotional, and cognitive growth. These studies performed within art education, health clinics, and other individually owned facilities were sought to make standards of practice because art therapy was becoming publicly known and needed to be regulated. The first kindergarten in Germany by Frederick Freboel in 1837 examined children. Freboel described children as plants and teachers as gardeners. The term kindergarten emerged, kinder meaning child and garden meaning garden. Theories about children were now evolving. Children were now said to have emotions, stages of development. According to the psychologist Jean Packet, before birth, the child is a psychobiological part of his mother. Not until sometime after birth does he gain a sense of his own identity, gradually coming to learn that he is no longer one with his mother, but a separate individual. This is why Freboel believed that in order for a child to develop to their full potential, they needed to be able to have hands-on learning through play. Freboel created what he called the gifts that an educator or parent could hand to a child or student to freely play with to learn motor skills as well as visual perceptions of the world around them. The kindergarten move to the United States began in 1848 when Germans were fleeing the country due to the Revolution. Karl Schwarz and Margaret Meyer Schwarz were the first ones to set up the first German-speaking kindergarten in the United States in 1855. It was not until 1960 that an English-speaking kindergarten was created by Elizabeth Peabody in Boston, Massachusetts. These schools paved the way for others to follow in their footsteps, to create school systems that promoted less intervention and less strict instruction so that children could learn through actual real-life experience. Educators began no longer spoon-feeding information to students. By the 1900s, the kindergarten movement had become very progressive. Free kindergartens were popular, and kindergarten was looked at as a community center for the neighborhood. These schools wanted students to come to their own conclusions and the established ways of understanding students' well-being. The start of the new ideas about children caused widespread support for improvements on legislature and creations of nonprofit organizations. Although these ideas were current throughout the 19th century in child labor reform, for example, the first identification of children as subjects of rights rather than objects of concern is usually associated with the work of Eglantine Jebb. Jebb urged to establish laws that would provide children with protection in education, the home, and labor. This time period was called the Child's Rights Movement, which began in 1919. This movement established laws on how long children were allowed to work and what jobs they were allowed to do. The National Child Labor Committee, established in 1904, worked to end child labor and was combined with efforts to provide free compulsory education for all children, and culminated in the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, which set federal standards for child labor. According to the article titled Child Labor in U.S. History, it states that the New England Association of Farmers, Mechanics, and Other Workmen believed that children should not be allowed to labor in the factories from morning till night, without any time for healthy recreation and mental culture, for it endangered their well-being and health. After massive changes in labor laws, education was also seeing major changes as well. Not only did schools become centers for playful, hands-on learning, but they also began incorporating art therapy to help children or students who lacked certain functionalities or abilities to communicate, due to what they considered to be from a missed developmental step. This began happening after the establishment of the term art therapy by Adrian Hill, as well as the child study movement. Study results of drawings done by different age levels throughout the schools created better school curriculums so that relevant materials were able to be provided to a set grade level. The actual use of therapeutic art therapy is not used very often within the school system due to regulations that have been placed upon it, but the design of class curriculum still contains hidden aspects from studies. It is important to note that the biggest influence over today's education is the standardization that the research from art therapy has brought with it. Aspects from the studies in art therapy are the use of imagery for the purpose of learning, studio art literature, performance art, and the list goes on. One aspect incorporated into the standardization of today's education is the use of guidance counselors, principals, for the purpose of keeping track of students' progress, setting guidelines of conduct, and for talking with students about personal matters. In rare cases, art therapy could be performed, but in most cases that is conducted at medical facilities. The medical practice of art therapy has been a fairly new discipline. Therefore, before now, there has not been a lot of information about the benefits and problems from treatment, but the research studies have allowed for better understanding of how interactions take place between one individual to another. The major issue for the majority of Americans has been that art therapy is a combination of multiple disciplines. Therefore, due to this, there are multiple viewpoints on the benefits and disadvantages of its uses. But throughout history, art therapy has typically been medical based after it became established as a profession. In summation, there has been many influences over art therapy, going from personal practice to special studies, to full-fledged practices contained inside schools or private facilities, to medical hospitals or clinics, and expert evaluations inside the arts and sciences into the media. The most significant person influencing art therapy was Adrian Hill, even though this may be a matter of opinion, because he established the term art therapy and shaped the way for others to make it a discipline. Art therapy as an occupation and the evaluation of policies that guided the profession into education. This has also attempted to give reasons as to why art therapy is important to education, medical, and labor, as well as provided the problems art therapy faces in order to allow for reader interpretation as to whether or not art therapy is truly important enough to support.